Victoria, welcome back to the podcast. I think you are now tied top of the ladder in number of appearances on the Health Love podcast.
Oh, wow. I feel blessed. Although, who is my competition? And we might need to have a showdown.
We'll do a three-way podcast to kind of see who wins.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me back, Alex. It is a pleasure to be here once again.
Yeah, and we were just saying off air how long it's been and how quickly that time has gone, because a lot has changed for you since that last chat when you were in South Africa.
Yeah, I think the granular beginnings of where I'm at now was kind of falling into place. And I was kind of talking around the edges of it and knowing kind of the themes, but nothing had really landed yet. And I think from that last conversation we had, the meandering journey that I have taken has kind of ended up here. So sort of like nearly 2 years later, I think we were just saying. So yes, it's been a shifting time.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful to hear what you've been up to, what you're doing, and we're going to dive into some of that today. But we were, again, sort of saying off air that I guess the theme, if there is going to be a theme for today, is really around trauma and the role that can play in our physical well-being, but obviously also psycho-emotional and spiritual as well.
Yeah.
So to throw the ball into your court, I guess, like how do we introduce and start a conversation around the role that trauma plays in this?
I think we probably need to back up and define trauma is, I think, where we start, because I think when you start talking about trauma and the words that we're going to maybe throw out over the course of this podcast, we're stepping into what is essentially a bit zeitgeist territory in the land of the interwebs, and everyone seems to be talking about trauma or the nervous system or somatics. And those three are really relevant things to talk about. And yet there's so much misinformation and misunderstanding happening. And I'm kind of in a bit of a fear space at the moment of, hang on a second, are we risking talking about this too much so people start to switch off? So I think defining trauma and actually getting that clear might be the place to start.
Okay, well, that sounds very sensible. So, with that in mind.
So define trauma, Victoria. Well, there's many ways to define trauma, but I will start with the sort of definition that we get from essentially psychology, and I'll add a little bit in. So trauma is the lingering psychosomatic effects of any experience that was too much, too fast, or too little for too long. And we can add a little element to that, because there is also the essence of those experiences in the absence of an empathetic witness. And that would be adding some terminology from a gentleman called Peter Levine, who has founded the Somatic Experiencing Institute to talk about resolving traumatic imprinting. And there's a lot to do with why that is the definition, which I'm happy to break down because I think it helps. I'm a very first principles educator. I'm like, that's just a word salad. That's just a lot of, that's just like a sentence that means, I don't know, what does it mean? So for me, I like to think of the trauma. It's not just traumatic events. Like, we can all go through a traumatic event and be okay afterwards. And what's the distinction between what's just a traumatic event and what gets laid down as a trauma imprint or unintegrated trauma? And if you're listening to any of the kind of people in the world, you'll hear these phrases of unintegrated trauma, trauma imprint. And these things basically mean that for some reason, and I'll qualify that reason in a second, a traumatic event or experience was not effectively metabolized by the human system. And so there is a lingering psychosomatic energy around that, which is creating consequences or behavioral adaptations in the now. So if you think about this, trauma happens in the past, but it doesn't always stay there. And the typical reason it doesn't stay there is because our nervous systems didn't cope with it very well at the time. And so what happens is you go through something that's relatively shocking, an event, an experience, or you go through a lot of shocks over time. And I will get into like what can be traumatic. So you go through all of those experiences, and for some reason, the human vehicle, including the physiology, the nervous system, the psychological system, and the emotional system, just didn't cope with it and went into one of the stress response states, or maybe several of them, or several at the same time. It's not like a on-off switch. And then the whole process wasn't completed effectively. So in essence, that energy of a traumatic experience is still living on inside the system. And this is why I like to explain what is actually trauma, because if you imagine that kind of imprinting living on inside the system, that is energetically draining, creating consequences for the human physiology and how it functions, it actually becomes really easy to understand how unintegrated trauma can lead to physiological consequences down the line, sometimes many decades later. So that's how this all ties together. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I think that was really well put. I mean, it's a complex area, and it was really interesting to get a definition, because of some of the conversations that I've seen, certain kind of social media type platforms, is people just even get into debate around what is trauma. Is someone who says they're traumatized actually traumatized, which is kind of the whole conversation that we won't worry about today. But it's nice to have your interpretation, your perspective of all that research that obviously you have done in this area. So it makes complete sense. I do have one question that came up, which might be helpful to clarify. And you mentioned obviously this stuff can manifest decades later. Do you mean by that that it may lie dormant for a period of time and then manifest, or that it's lingering over potentially decades, or both?
Both. So essentially what I typically see in my client population, which tends to span the gamut, but I still have my complex chronic illness people, but I also have like high performers who want to get over a behavior that they're not happy with or whatever. I see the kind of genesis of all of those things as typically traumatic experiences, and the different traumatic experiences lead to different end results. And that's a whole huge study that I'm still immersing myself in. But what I have witnessed is that what tends to be the case is that there's some lingering behavior patterns that might be there that are consistent from the moment that the trauma experiences occurred. And, traumas can happen over a long period of time. The kind of subtle lack of love from a parent or a significant caregiver is a traumatic experience. And this can kind of just be in the system and be something that you kind of adapt around. You adapt your entire orientation to the world around how you were maybe parented as a child, or the shocking events that happened to you that weren't quite metabolized through your system. So the orientation shift. So if we're talking about the lingering effects, that orientation to the world is maybe different. And then still there can be a triggering event later. Now, that can either be something that's incredibly similar to the original trauma, that just to your nervous system, and this isn't in the land of conscious perception, it's just energetically something happens which is very reminiscent of the stress, the something, the energy space, something about that moment in the now that could be decades later, puts us back to where we were. Because I like to think of it like, we kind of get interrupted if we have significant traumas, especially big one-off events. It's like our whole system gets shocked in that moment and gets interrupted, and we carry on, but there's kind of a fragment of us that's still way back then. And then if that is then triggered in the now, a whole cascade can take place, which can seem shocking and dramatic, but is contextual to the human physiology. And I think that's the part that I really want to stress about all of this. It's like we see illness and maybe behaviors and all of these things as problems because we're looking at it from the conscious mind perspective of judgment and assessment of, well, hang on a second, that's not a very sensible thing, we must be flawed in some way. But to our reptilian, most mammal selves, everything we do in life is not a mistake. It's an adaptation that we feel from a somatic lens is necessary in that moment to survive, typically. And so everything is completely contextual. Even the illnesses that we see, that you and I see in clinical practice, it's like the system isn't messing up. It's doing something that is contextual to the thing that it feels is alive and present within it, that it needs to adapt around and continue to play out the behavior pattern.
Okay. Very well put, Victoria.
Thank you.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think a word that came to mind through that description was also kind of relational. How we're relating to ourselves, to the environment, to the world, there's an imprint there as well. We're perceiving things based on those previous experiences that are then guiding everything ultimately.
100%. And I explain this to clients and students all the time. It's like the nervous system. Like, what is the nervous system? It's the computer that tells us how to be in the world, and essentially relational, how to relate in the world. And how it does that is it takes all of the information from the body itself. So everything that's happening in your system, it relays that up to the brain, and everything that you can sense with your five senses, but also energetically from the world around you through all of the senses into the brain. And then the brain is the computational, like literally framework. But that brain and that somatic, everything that you had experienced, it is the framework through which those inputs are interpreted. And so the nervous system is just interpreting the feedback that it's getting from the world and from within you, and marshalling a response that is contextually appropriate to the experience. And so we talk about trauma being stored in the body and all of those things. And it's not like there's like a little location where you can go and actually like get a scalpel and open it and you'll find like a memory of trauma. It's much more that the adaptations somatically, and I've used that word a lot and I will define it in a second, but the somatic adaptations we make around the imprinting that we've had will directly alter the way our nervous system will relay messages back up to the brain, and also what our body will then do as a result. And so somatically, let's just define it, because again, the world of the interwebs seems to want to take things. It's a reductionist world. Like, how can we create a meme? And the problem with things like trauma and somatics is you can't create memes or, GIFs that make any sense, because it's such a complex world. But somatics isn't just the body, and I think people are kind of getting confused about this. It's not the physiology, it's the totality of your human self. And there's various different definitions, but it's essentially the whole being. And what we're trying to convey by the word somatic is not just the physiology, but the felt sense. So yes, it's very physical, but it's also sensations, and it's also within the kind of energetic reality of what somebody is holding on to. And this all sounds very abstract, but if you just think about, when you walk into a room and you suddenly feel like something's wrong and you don't know what in the environment has told you that, you don't have any inputs cognitively that say there's something wrong here, but your entire system goes, oh, and you just feel unsafe. That is a somatic response to an environment. And that's as simple as you can get. It's your whole being, including the thoughts, and you're literally instantly in what's up, like, and you start scanning the environment. Mm-hmm. That is a somatic response to something that is beneath the conscious perception, but your animal self is picking up and going, hang on, be on alert, something's here.
Okay. And that brings up, it might even be in a Peter Levine book where he uses an example of, you could be walking past a shop, the shop might be very quietly playing a song, but that song takes you back to a memory from your childhood. You're not consciously aware of that music, but as you say, there is an element of you, I guess, that is, and it's triggered a physiological / psychological response, but there isn't necessarily a rational explanation you have in that moment as to why. Is that the same sort of thing?
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you chose like the song, because songs and like music, so evocative, and you'll have it consciously as well. And when you're in the car and that song comes on and suddenly your mood changes completely because it's reminiscent of something, and you may not be able to of historic experiences and triggering things. So if we're talking smells and sounds, you can understand that we're in very primitive kind of reflexes here. This is very kind of subconscious, like frequency patterns, and smells bypass so much of our human evolution. So they bypass the neocortex, they go straight into subdomains of the brain, which means that they very quickly get beneath layers of rational thought. So that can be very, like, you can walk past a bakery and it can be like exactly the smell that was in your childhood and suddenly you feel warm and fuzzy, or you can walk past, some kind of different place and just suddenly have almost like a memory that isn't a conscious memory, but your body is remembering. And all of that is there because essentially what you're trying to do in life is two things. I mean, I know we're trying to do a lot more that we think of, but really all we're trying to do is stay alive and procreate. It's literally all our beings care about. And so that nervous system isn't thinking, oh, hang on, is this advantageous for my influencer social media following? It's literally going, am I going to die? That's about it. So that's what the nervous system's scanning for. So in my example, when you walk into the room, that kind of somatic response is because somewhere your body interpreted a threat, and it's much more biologically advantageous for you to assume it's a threat rather than go, oh no, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay. Because if it's really a threat, your physiology is built for preemptive strike. So let's prep ourselves just in case, because we can always, and I'll qualify this in a second too, but we can always come down from a stress response, but we can't like react with latency because we might literally die. And what happens in people with lingering impacts of trauma is that coming down from a stress response becomes tricky. So there's a lot of talk about nervous system regulation, and again, very poorly explained by people on the interwebs, but nervous system regulation doesn't mean perfectly happy, calm, sweet, lovely all the time. It means you have the capacity, a well-regulated nervous system has the capacity to go into that alertness. You just walked into the room, and then you kind of recognize that the thing that your system interpreted was a threat actually was totally benign, and you can relax very quickly down into feeling totally safe again. That's a well-regulated nervous system. And also, you can go to sleep and really drop off to sleep and wake up, and there isn't kind of like this cranking of the gears of like, oh my God, I'm really stressed because you woke up in an emergency state. It's actually, you just wake up and suddenly you're in this kind of regulated, let's go and do life. That's well regulated. A dysregulated or a disorganized nervous system essentially goes into the stress states and can't fully metabolize out of that, even when the threat has been established as not a threat. So there's various ways that this can turn into dysfunction, but essentially hypervigilance, so seeing things as threatening when they aren't really all the time, and constantly scanning, constantly thinking, oh my God, there might be danger, or being constantly outside of that regulated, peaceful state because you're actually just literally on the edge all the time. And we say these words like, I feel on edge today. That's kind of it. But the thing that gets me is that so many things go into whether you're feeling well regulated or not, including how well you slept, how nourished are you, how hydrated are you. So you will understand this from the kind of the functional medicine lens, but there's so many things that go into this, which is why I'm kind of passionate about people who are working in the nervous system world understanding the human physiology, because it's not just trauma that makes us not really cope with life very well. There's so many underlying things. And yeah, we could get into, well, why aren't you nourishing yourself properly? Maybe that's a trauma. But realistically, there's so many ways to intervene here. And there is such we aren't able to be reductionist about some of this stuff because it's super complex, because human vehicles are complex.
Yeah. I mean, as you said sort of just there as well, the behavioral side of this is so complex. So we are, yeah, it just is one big messy soup is the saying that I sometimes. But I mean, if you want to, after you, Victoria.
No, I was just going to say, like, and I think sometimes it's messy because we're trying to understand it with the brain that is only a fraction of the whole human. And I think that's the problem. It's like, and then our brain is trying to make meaning out of it all the time. And, I have been guilty of this in the past myself. It's like, making meaning out of things when actually it just is an isness. And we get to resolve it from the perspective of, okay, so what's the sensation? What is here right now? Not what are we then trying to make that mean about ourselves? And I think this is where I really step into the kind of medical headspace of just thinking about that hypervigilance. I think about everybody with multiple chemical sensitivity syndromes or those overreactive immune systems. It's literally the next step from having a hypervigilant nervous system. Obviously, that's a huge oversimplification, but we're in that territory. And so that making meaning of, I had that, whatever mold exposure or the metal things or whatever, like all of the stuff that we do, or the nervous system is just literally stressed and we think it's unsafe all the time. And so this is kind of what I was fumbling around with a lot when I was running my functional medicine clinic, because I could sense this, but I didn't have the cognitive structure of it in my brain to fully be able to codify it and to truly help my clients. So a lot of my work was kind of in this realm, but not fully kind of getting the total nuts and bolts of it. And also taking out all of the judgment and the context and just going, this is so normal from a human physiological perspective. In fact, it's hyper normal. You'd be weird if you weren't overreacting right now. That's the truth of it. So from that place, how do we then support the resolution of these physiological illnesses, and I'm putting that in inverted commas, when it's really physiological adaptations that have a negative consequence in the human life?
Yeah. Oh, it's hard to emphasize some of those key points. That was really well put again. And I think one of the things that came up for me there was, well, one of the early things was in many ways what you were talking about earlier with nervous system regulation sounded very familiar with the concepts like heart rate variability. Really, as you say, how well is that nervous system adapting to the environment that we're putting it in ultimately? Which then brings us back to this theme of kind of resilience. And another thing you were saying there, why is it that some people could have sky high positive mycotoxin results or heavy metal results or whatever it may be, but be walking down the high street relatively asymptomatic, while someone else can have way less going on, but feel completely debilitated by that. And for me, is a tragic / beautiful mystery of the human experience ultimately, and what you've said there really connects some of those dots ultimately, I guess.
And it's resilience is one of those things, and I know it's your kind of big thing, and it is so, there's so many factors in it. And what I should probably stress is that one of the biggest differences between the people who are, as you just put it, and almost in any of the things that we can, our fancy functional medicine tests where we can check all these levels of stuff. You and I know, because we're old hands at this now, where you can see wildly different on paper results and wildly different symptomatic, and it's not linear. They don't correlate. And what I see in the difference is, what resources does that human being have underneath the presence of sky high mycotoxins? And for me, resources is a really good word to use, because it doesn't just mean your physiological stability to start with. It really means everything in your world. And the thing that the kind of add-on that Levine did with that, in the absence of an empathetic witness from a traumatic event, what he's trying to allude to in that is that human beings are social creatures that absolutely need community and co-regulation from a nervous system perspective. And I think one of the tragedies in chronic illness is the isolation that it breeds into the life, because it is, you can't take part, you can't participate in life as normal. And what that does is it steps you out of social dynamics, and it steps you out of being a social animal. And we are social animals. You watch animals in the wild on those wildlife videos, and they're grooming each other. And whilst I'm not suggesting you go around and start grooming your fellow man, we're actually biologically not that far away from that. But we can groom without, that's a terrible word to use, Victoria, but you know what I mean. And we can support with our energetic and nervous system. We don't need to actually stroke someone's hair, although you can. Ask permission first, please, consent. But we can be very nourishing with our nervous system to another human being. And so when I look at these different people, before I take on a client these days, I ask very little in a onboarding questionnaire. I don't want somebody to be re-traumatized by me asking really traumatic questions of trauma instigating things. But I do ask, how well resourced are people? And I say, who's in your network? Do you have good friends that you can rely on? Do you have good, a family system which keeps you safe? And I have noticed distinct difference in the symptom map and the ability to cope with the stuff when people are under-resourced versus people who have those resources. Someone said to me the other day, given my history, which people who've listened to any of our previous episodes will know, somebody said, I really don't know how you coped with it all. And I just said to them, I wasn't doing it on my own. I had very few people, but I had my mum as an anchor throughout every single second. And I have no idea what would have happened had that not been there, because it meant that every appointment that I went to that was terrible or dissatisfactory, I went and complicated science, but I ventral vaguely engaged. Now, the polyvagal theory is a different kind of understanding of the nervous system, which suggests that we have two branches of the parasympathetic nervous system branch, which is really interesting when you think about nervous system function. And the parasympathetic is the more rest and digest in a healthy expression. But it is also that kind of like metabolizing of the stress response, metabolizing that kind of sympathetic overdrive, that charging. The parasympathetic is how we metabolize it out the system. And we do it in two ways. We do it in resting, and that would be in the dorsal vagal response, where we just sleep and we kind of like allow ourselves to hibernate and just be in the space. But we also do it socially through the ventral vagal response. And we're incredibly social beings, where we just like, I mean, you know, when you've been through something and you just want to like run to the next room and tell your wife about it. That's the ventral vagal response in action, going, blah, 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 I need to get this out of me into air, but please can you be here with me in it? And so that level of resourcing and ability to talk about stuff is so important. And I think the kind of judgments and shame that we as a society put on people's stuff doesn't help that in terms of the manifestation of lingering symptoms of trauma.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. And I can just think of previous clients where that sort of that resourcing, that network, as you say, wasn't there, and they did have less positive outcomes, should we say. So that's a really interesting sort of relationship that you've seen there through the questioning that you do. A thought, and it comes from two things. One is I recently read a book called Crazy Like Us, which is all about
sign me up to that group. Yes.
And I'm going to very oversimplify this and maybe butcher a little bit, but the general concept is that we have a very westernized concept of mental health, and we have pushed it out into the world, and we haven't respected different cultures' ways of relating and processing, integrating trauma. And it's a really powerful book that I think is kind of a must read in this sort of space, I guess, as well. So that kind of came to mind. The second thing was, and I haven't yet shared anything about my retreat from last week, but there is one thing that I actually do want to share based on what you were sharing there, Victoria, which is in both ceremonies, I have absolutely no doubt that I started to establish a stronger relationship with my spirit guides. The entry into both of those psychedelic ceremonies was actually identical, which was kind of interesting in its own right. You know, there was a breeze that I felt. We were inside and the window wasn't open, but there was this very, very similar connection, introduction to these two entities / beings. And I absolutely believe that they are my spirit guides, bringing me into that sort of energetic space. And I bring that up because I think in the modern world and in modern society, we don't have, how do I want to put it? We don't have that spiritual side, or not many of us do. We're not brought up with that there. So not only do many of us not have strong human relationships, but we also aren't very resourced from I will call it, you know, the spiritual selves or our spiritual lives as well. And I think that's a little bit heartbreaking as well, that, you know, we've lost that deeper connection that we might be able to lean into and resource if we're able to kind of cultivate it and have tribes and communities that helped us get back in touch with that side of things that was ever present from an evolutionary sort of perspective.
Thank you for sharing that. It really speaks to a conversation I've been having recently with people, with a person in particular in this space. And I've been on as we alluded to at the start, an interesting journey in the last couple of years. And I started my health crisis journey in the land of the spiritual. I was looking to consciousness evolution. I was contemplating archetypes. I was never from a particularly organized religion perspective, but I was seeking kind of connection to the energies that I could feel and sense, and that felt bigger than us, essentially, some kind of organizing principle that was bigger than the humans that I could see. And I began essentially with looking at planetary stuff. So I was never really into astrology, but I did study human design for 7 years with the founder of human design. And anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's like a self-awareness system that looks very mechanical, but is actually very kind of esoteric. and the affiliated system of gene keys. And I spent a long time with the original gene keys community formulating that system and trying to understand what that is. And both of these two systems that I've just mentioned are just discussing 64 essential archetypes of human consciousness. We're very much in the land of not necessarily woo, because it's not very kind of like, we're not talking spirit guides necessarily or angels or anything like that, but we are very much talking about that connection to consciousness and to what makes us bigger than just the individual human, and what connects us in that sense of kind of the connectedness of consciousness. And I spent a long time in that world trying to find my answers, trying to find my healing, and I didn't find it. And that's the moment when I found medicine and I found the biological of the infrastructure. And it was a necessary piece. I absolutely needed to understand the biomechanics and the mechanisms and the cascades of stuff that happens from a physiological perspective. But I got stuck there for a while. And that was my kind of 7 years of running my functional medicine practice in the UK. I was very much in this kind of like medical world, always sensing that I was finding myself talking about people's adverse childhood experiences, not their stool test results. And I was like, I know I'm not aligned, but I can't make I can't segue this from this like medical kind of thing. And that was one of the reasons why I left the UK in 2019. I was about to, as you probably know, I was about to build a whole new clinic with a multidisciplinary team, because I was getting the sense that more was necessary, more people needed an infrastructure of support. We needed like that team of people to hold people in their healing. And I just had a moment and I was like, I need to work out what this is. And that's why I went to Africa. And so in South Africa, I was really in a process of introspection. Right before lockdown, I remember standing outside just before I got locked down. We just relocated me because I was about to get locked down. And in Africa, we were not allowed out of the house. So I needed to move houses because I needed a better place to be. And I said to a friend out there, I said, I'm really feeling called to return to looking at gene keys and human design. It's coming to me a lot. And that was the beginning of lockdown for me. And that reintegration of spirituality into what I was looking at has actually led me slightly strangely into the more mechanistic scientific understanding of trauma and nervous systems from a kind of codify that perspective. And I still sense that the next bit, the bit where all of my stuff is going at this moment in time, and it's still being breathed into life. It's much more formed than it was, but it's still being breathed into life. And literally on Monday night, I had this conversation with someone and I just said, that connection piece, the connection to something greater, is something that has to be in everything that we do from a healing human perspective, because we can human with each other. But I think there also needs to be there's something in the human system that needs to connect to something that's more mystical. And whilst I've just said a lot about don't make meaning of like symptoms and stuff like that, I actually feel like there is, a meaning that we derive from having some organizing principle or connection to energy that is greater than us. And I feel like I've created a little diagram, and you just touched on it. And so for the training that I'm running, I've created a little diagram which talks about like the stuff that we can intervene with as a coach or as a professional practitioner. And it's kind of got food, like fuel, as in everything that nourishes us kind of structurally, physically, functionally. Mind, as in all of the thoughts, beliefs, perspectives, subconscious stuff. Then the inner landscape of the kind of what's underneath the somatic layers of stored physiology. And then the fourth pillar is all about connection. And it is connection to fellow man, but also connection to our inner self, our soul, and connection upwards to a greater something or other.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I think connection, as you say, it's such a key part of it. And as you say, not connection with ourselves, connection with others, connection with maybe a sense of purpose. Although I still don't really know where I stand with this concept of life purpose, but something I think can be helpful. So yeah, that's really interesting. And I think
it's interesting that you say about life's purpose, because life, like, so in Gene Keys, there is a whole thing called life's purpose, and everyone comes to me saying, what's my life's purpose? I want to know what my life's purpose is. And I'm like, life's purpose is the thing that you work out on your deathbed and you look back and you go, oh, that's what it was about. It's the thing that happens as you're doing the thing. And I that's how I see life's purpose, because I kind of just have to take a step back and trust that it's the end result of me being me, doing me, staying true to me. So that's my 2 cents on life's purpose.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And I think there's so much stuff out there about it. You know, you get people that really push you to have a very clear concept of, you know, your life purpose is about doing certain things. But I think fundamentally, and this is only where I'm at this point in time, obviously, but part of me feels that it's another distraction from just being human. You know, when did life purpose become a thing in the first place? And it's not that long ago.
Right.
And it can be incredibly powerful, and it can get people through awful things. It can give people resiliency, is the way I guess to think about it. But I think sometimes it can also add immense pressure to someone else, or maybe to the same person at a different time in their life. And certainly, if I look back to various experiences, for example, in breath work, when you kind of drop out of the head and into your body and into a softer space, you suddenly realize that, yeah, I'm not sure I really need a life purpose if it's going to cause too much friction or stress. We are relational beings who can just be that. That can be really liberating and empowering and lovely.
Well, and you know, maybe my life's purpose is to smile at the person in the grocery store who's having a really terrible day, but they happen to be the person who's going to, I don't know, invent the cure for cancer. And because I smiled, they went back to their lab more positive and did something a bit more creative. And suddenly, I mean, but it doesn't have to be. I could just be the person who smiled at the person in the grocery store, and that person felt better for half an hour.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty awesome purpose, just to smile a little bit more and to bring a bit more light. And I think as well, like, that's not to say that I don't have a life's mission, and I do separate them, because my mission is something that I'm kind of like, it's the through line, which means that, which allows everything that I do to make sense, and not everything I do from like, am I going out for coffee with that person on Thursday night, or am I going to, I mean, that's just me humaning, but the business decisions, you know, as an entrepreneur making businesses, the business decisions make sense because they fall around a mission. But that doesn't, I'm not wedded to my mission as in this has to happen, otherwise I have failed. It's like, I'm just setting this as a kind of path to follow, and let's see what happens.
Right.
Like, yeah, because we all know the sentence, life is what happens whilst you're busy making other plans. So, you know, but it's interesting because connection's been the thing that's been the theme of my last year and a bit. And, you know, for those who don't know, which is probably all of your audience, I'm now in Austin, Texas. I am no longer in South Africa. And the reason I'm in Austin is connection, it's community, it's people. And I've suddenly realized, no, I've always known how fundamental people are. And I've watched my circles change as I have been more focused on turning inwards towards ensuring that I'm showing up as myself. And I have moved organically. As I've shown up differently, I've needed different people. And so I think that's kind of been my little journey of connecting. And I do think it's that dual focus. It's being inwardly focused on doing your stuff so that the people that surround you become aligned to that part of you, that wholeness of you, rather than the person you were trying to be.
Beautiful. And that reminds me of a conversation I had in our previous podcast episode with Ben Bidwell, aka what's his Instagram handle? The Naked Professor, I think.
The Naked Professor, I think he is.
Yeah. And we spoke very briefly just about this idea, and it's been a key message for me in the last 2 years, which is, I guess, the concept of duality. You know, in one situation, polar opposite statements can both be true at the same time. And what's our capacity to be able to sit with that complexity and understand that? And I think that's such a skill that we can all kind of cultivate and understand that at least sometimes, and this probably is projection on my part, but sometimes, you know, if we are in a state of fear, for example, we're going to cling to things with a little bit more certainty to create that safety.
100%.
But because it can be destabilizing, you know, taking, what's the word I want to use? I guess dismantling our belief systems is destabilizing. And then it's like, well, who am I? What am I doing? What is life? and suddenly there's a lot of questions that you can't answer. Everything is true.
So true. Right. No, it's so true. And like, I have a coach. So as a client, I had that existential crisis when I started working more deeply with my coach. And as a coach, every client goes through that. If we're dismantling everything I thought to be true, who am I? What am I doing? Is everything just not accurate? Am I and it is a necessary deconstruction. Like in spiritual words, we call it an ego death or something along those lines. But I have always been obsessed with the capacity to hold paradoxes. I was very lucky to be exposed to Ra Uru Hu, who was the founder of human design, because he had this really irritating habit of like making a sentence statement, very forceful, very kind of closed statement, and then just adding or not at the end. And you'd be like, sorry, just back up a sec. Is it or isn't it? Like, or not? And the point he was trying to make, and everything in the ancient Chinese I Ching, which is where human design and Jinkies come from, is the duality. It's this is or it's not. And so you're sitting there going, what am I supposed to do with that? And the reality is that everything is and it isn't. And I think this is a really important thing for anyone on a healing journey or anyone who's a professional helping others on a healing journey. It is our job to hold that paradox of everything is perfect. I said it earlier about your body is not screwed up. It is doing exactly what it feels is the right thing to do to keep you alive. It's miraculous. And you want it to change. And those two things are so both true, but we can't just focus on I want it to change, because it puts you in a space of othering your body right now in this moment in time. And no good was ever achieved by beating yourself up. So hating on your current physical status doesn't help anything or anyone. So it's that combination of, wow, this is an intelligent system. It's causing me pain and it's causing me symptoms, and I don't like them, and frustration and anger and upset. All of those symptoms is totally necessary to feel, but really valuing it from the perspective of, well, it doesn't feel very good, but wow, is this an intelligent response? And I would like it to change. And that whole map of approach that come from resolving any illness or any issue, I think is super empowering for professionals and for people with illness or any kind of symptoms.
Yeah. And as you say, it just transforms everything. It transforms how you relate to the changes that have to occur for those changes in the body to occur. You know, are you taking your supplements in the morning because there's an underlying belief that I'm broken and I need fixing, or are you taking them because you're cultivating health and you're moving forwards towards what it is that you want to achieve? And I think even those subtle changes in how you relate and the story attached to it can make a real difference there.
And also, are you taking them because you're frightened of not? That's a really interesting one. So with my like biohackers who have like the perfectly constructed 27-step morning routine and I'm like, that's an addiction. What would happen if that went away? Because all you've done is create another form of external stability. It speaks to what you were saying earlier about gripping. Fear causes us to grip because we feel unstable, so we grip to something. And so a lot of people just transfer one grip to another grip. Like, I have to do the workout. My life would implode if I didn't do this thing. And I'm not saying that, oh, I feel better when I exercise, therefore I'm going to do it. Great, lovely. But my life would feel really unstable if I didn't do my regular exercise. That's a very different relationship. And so that, you know, everything in our companies is all about taking out, removal, not addition. It's not you will get better by the 27-step morning routine. It's how can we bring more flow so that your relationship to all of this is organic, not constructed.
How do we do that, Victoria?
Constant work over time. And it really is. I'm so fascinated by the intelligence of the body and giving authority back to the body in various ways, but being in that space of allowing this whole system to lead rather than the mind. And it's the mind that constructs that 27-step routine and thinks, oh my God, if I miss step 7, I have to start all over again, or like the whole day is ruined. It's the mind that makes meaning out of the thing. And it's the mind that seeks to feel kind of like complete by having that structure. The body doesn't always need it. And so putting authority back into the body, and I start really small. It's like, I always use this with my human design clients. It's like, I have 2 shampoos in my shower. They do different things. I don't choose which shampoo on a routine of like, oh, yesterday was that one, therefore today is that one. I look at them and I see which one my body moves towards in the morning. That's just the simple statement of this system that has way more knowledge than I have in my small brain, knows so much more about what's right for me in this moment than I can calculate. And so if I stop trying to calculate and I start just existing, what changes? And I think that's the miraculous bit. And just to put this out there, allowing the existence and flow is way more challenging if we have a history of trauma and traumatic experiences. And that's where I live and work and breathe, because I support those people for whom being in the present moment is the scariest thing possible, because everything about being in their physiology and the present moment is unsafe to them. That's what I've ended up doing in my life. Obviously, that's my experience. That's literally my lived reality from various perspectives, both genetic, illness, trauma, all of those things. My current moment lived reality is not a safe place. So my work in my lifetime, speak of life purpose, is to create much more of a felt sense of safety so that I can be in my shower in the morning and not have a calculating mind and flow to the shampoo. And that's a tiny example, but if you expand that to everything, people, conversations, big decisions, all of that, it allows for those to be an emanation from your essence and not a, oh, I think I better clunkily get into the calculatedness of doing this thing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Again, I said this actually in the previous podcast, so people can get really bored of my points, but I was journaling this morning, and one of the things that just sort of bubbled up was, the idea of, I called it those fuck yeah moments, when you're just all in, and it's not a cognitive decision as such. There is a felt sense that this is absolutely the right decision at this point in time. And it's a bodily thing. It's a heart and gut space sort of sensation, I think. I love the idea of, having choices of shampoo or whatever it may be, teas, coffee, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And listening to the body's response, ultimately. I think that's a really great takeaway for all of us to apply.
And I do seriously start with small things. Like I'm in Austin, and where you can get any drink under the sun, kombucha and fancy yerba mate teas and whatever, and I have a selection in my fridge, and I don't walk downstairs thinking, oh, I really fancy the blueberry thing with the ginger shot. I walk down there, I open the fridge and I pick, and there's a very great sense of, over the last couple of years I have moved way more away from the calculating, especially business wise. Actually, I was in a scenario where there was a lot of kind of calculate this thing and do this thing because it's the right thing to do from a business perspective. And I was like, I physically can't. I want to stick pins in my eyes, but also it doesn't feel right. Like I had this like whole 5-year plan and I was like about 3 months in, I was like, that's not happening. Because it didn't feel, I was doing it because it made sense on paper, not because it made sense to my nervous system.
And I guess a lot of what you're saying, Victoria, really kind of, it reminds me of so many conversations with clients where they've been so clinging to certainty, is one way of thinking about it. Really needing it to be black and white, and really clinging to a specific symptom, a specific biomarker in a test of 100 biomarkers or whatever it may be. And it's obviously completely understandable to some degree. I've been there myself in my health journey. but it's a sign, I would propose, that, certainly we're stuck in our heads, and we need to gently, slowly do what you've been talking about there, which is start to trust the body, start to lean into that intuition, and in many ways open ourselves up to that innate healing intelligence. Simple example, if you cut a finger, you don't sit there panicking it's not going to heal. You have trust in that. So can we start to cultivate a bit more trust in these other things, symptoms, whether it's bloating or whatever it may be?
And I also want to say that that's such a good point, and having compassion for the way your mind is being directed, because your thoughts are being directed by the physiology. I think people forget this. We get into, put the body first and let it lead, and then we start to demonize the mind. Realistically, your thoughts, the quality of your thoughts is directed by the energy of your whole system. So the reason those clients are micro focusing on the one marker in a list of 1,000 or whatever is for the same reason that in the environment you step into and you're scared, your literal pupils will micro focus on the one thing that could be the potential enemy. Back to my walking into the room example, you walk in and your peripheral closes and you start scanning from a very targeted perspective. Where's the threat? Where's the threat? Where's the threat? That is exactly what our mind does when we get these beautiful functional medicine labs, which are super complicated and often really unhelpful because they give us like crib sheets of stuff. I tend to delete all of that stuff for my clients so they don't get the kind of like, oh, it's this thing. And I'm just like, no, just have the like list, but don't get the takeaways, because the takeaways, no computer algorithm yet can get those takeaways from a complex systems perspective yet. I'm sure we're working on it, but that level of micro focus that you can then go into of like, it's the B6 level. If I just fix my B6, or if I just fix my methylation status, whatever that means, then I will be better. And it's like, whew, but it's not about demonizing that thought process. It's about understanding that that's coming from the fact that your whole system is in, where's the threat? Where's the threat? And you will find it on labs. That's the problem with doing these kind of labs.
Yeah, compassion is definitely a theme that is coming up a lot at the moment. As you say, understanding that and holding it lightly is essential. And you just raised something actually that you reminded me of, or a question came to mind when you were discussing something earlier, which was around the physical and the physiological, and how that can drive, for want of a better way of putting this, dysfunction in the brain or compartments of the brain that then influence our feeling of safety. Thinking of like the amygdala, for example.
It's a catch-22 situation. So what I tend to find is that the clients that I will get are in such a state of physiological dysregulation, whatever the cause point of that, they're in such a state of physiological dysregulation that in and of itself is unsafe. So it's this feedback loop of, I think I might not be unsafe because, insert said trauma history here. Oh, hang on a second, I've got this input from the body, the physiological symptoms, whether it's just bloating or whatever it is, but bloating's enough of a sense that something's wrong. The message goes back up to the brain, there's something wrong, especially digestively, actually, because the digestive system is outside of us, so it's threats from the outside world, which clearly we're not coping. So I'm threatened, the sense of threat just builds, so the stress response just escalates, which is why we see people start getting ill and then it just gets worse and worse and worse and it becomes progressive. And so the way I work with these types of people is from both directions. And it's where I think the trauma world is missing something, because they are trying to resolve from even somatics, trying to resolve from a felt sense or a energetic perspective, something which has actually become a problem, quote unquote. And so you can't do it, because you can't encourage a felt sense of safety in someone who's got an active metabolic or physiological or bacterial problem. So you can't just do somatic experiencing practitioner stuff. You also can't just do functional medicine stuff, this is why we have these kind of recalcitrant issues, because they're not recalcitrant. You're just never really resolving the problem. You're fixing the symptom, taking down I'm going to use SIBO because it's always my example, but taking down the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and treating it with some antimicrobial amazing treatments and getting on top of it. And everyone's like, but it comes back. It's so difficult to get rid of. It's not difficult to get rid of. We've proved it's not, because you did. The reason it's coming back is the somatic stress response that is still living on inside your nervous system. So I have a very great both and approach. And I am so incredibly lucky because I've had all of this education, but it took me so many trainings and modules and extra certifications and, add on the things to try and get to this understanding of why the single systems aren't working and why I can't just take a client from and give them a beautiful antimicrobial protocol, because they'll be back in my office. And I don't like my clients that much. I really want to get rid of them, said in the nicest way possible. I love all my clients actually, but I don't want to keep seeing them. I don't want anyone to be dependent on me. So what I was doing within kind of the end of my major functional medicine stuff in the UK was kind of going, well, here's your landscape of problems. I can do this bit, but you need these people. And sort of over the last couple of years, I've gone into, I need to build this skill set because I can't refer to anybody else because they don't understand the physiological that's underneath. So having those people who've got the lens of everything is my passion at the moment, really finding and ingraining in people that there's more than just the one micro lens. Even if it's the best trauma resolution lens, even if it's the best functional medicine lens, it's like, well, great, but can you talk to each other, please?
Yeah, so true. And that's why I just love that quadrant of, the physical, the spiritual, the mental, and the emotional. Obviously, at a very basic level, it's just appreciating that all four are often needed to be at least considered. And we may need some interventions and support around more than just one of them, as you said there. But that's the challenge. Having worked in a few clinics where they've tried to have a integrated team, it's just never worked. People work in silo, coming in and out on their shifts, and there's just not that. There's never been the structure. There's never been the right structure to allow it to work as well as it could.
And it's interesting because that's what I was going to build just before I left London. I had the name, the staff, the website built, everything. Then I ran away very far from it. I was like, screw functional medicine. I'm not doing it. Like, it's all about trauma. So I'm going really hard in the opposite direction. And, a couple of months ago, I brought the name, the brand, the logo, everything back, because I now can see how to do it. And what I feel is necessary are people like myself with the multidisciplinary hat that can see all of the relevant bits and be the linchpin for the whole team, and then having specialists underneath them that speak back to the to do it. So that's currently what I'm kind of building in the longer term essence.
Nice. We missed the last 30 seconds of that, Victoria.
Oh no.
Yeah, you froze at
I froze.
Specialists under the linchpin.
I was literally giving you my entire business model, Alex. Your listeners are just going to have to wait. No, I'm kidding. I will repeat it because it was brilliant. So having those linchpin people who can understand the everything are really essential to be able to integrate the specialists, because if you expect the specialists to come out of their silos to talk to one another, things get lost in translation because they are coming from a specific lens and it's not their job to understand the other specialist. So what you need is that kind of pyramid structure of somebody who understands all the specialisms that can orchestrate the team around the client at the center, but they become that kind of all-consuming aware person. And some people will only need that multi-hatted person. Some people will absolutely need additional specialisms, but it's that like linchpin that gets to, decide and help the client decide. So that's what I'm building. So the Alethea Clinic is back, and it hopefully eventually will be a really big center here in Austin.
Wow, fantastic.
Mm.
Excellence. Mindful of your time, Victoria, is there anything that you would like to add to today's conversation that we haven't yet touched on, or is there anything that you want to sort of emphasize or conclude with?
I think it's been a really interesting conversation all around the trauma lens and stuff like that. And I really just would encourage that if you're a professional listening to this, understanding about these things, I kind of see it as our professional responsibility. And it's not difficult to get educated in this kind of stuff. It's difficult to get good education, but there are definite ways to improve our understanding so that we are really helping people and meeting them where they're at, and developing, being a trauma-informed functional medicine practitioner will change your entire practice, hands down.
So do you want to just, obviously you have a course that starts in essentially a month.
I do.
Do you want to just sort of touch on this and
speak on this? Yeah. So essentially, if you've just listened to my Alethea Clinic overview, there aren't enough people who can be those linchpins. So what I realized a few months ago is I need to create this training that has been in the back of my kind of realms for a long, long time, because we need holistic healing professionals who can be a different breed of healer. They're not necessarily coaches, although they are. They're not necessarily functional medicine practitioners, although they have an understanding. They're not human design consultants, but they can give an interpretation of people's innate qualities so that it can help. And I was like, well, I'm probably the only person in the world that can create this training, so I better do it. So I have. And so I have created an 11-month essentially academic year training for holistic healing professionals. You actually don't need to have any education to begin with. You don't need to be in this space, although you can be. And I have a lot of people on the course who kind of already toes in this world in various ways, doctors and coaches, all that kind of stuff. But it's essentially an education as a complete holistic coach, which takes us from the basics of coaching, the science of the nervous system, all about trauma, and how that fits in, a whole education on human physiology, from how does all this layer together into physical symptoms, and how does the physical affect the psycho, spiritual, emotional, all that kind of stuff, into coaching techniques, inner child, gestalt techniques, parts work, so internal family systems is all going to be in there, into the mindset stuff, NLP, CBT, cognition, how to cue clients, how to talk to clients so that they're in the right mind space rather than being somewhere else, and also how to judge from your clients' linguistics how they see and perceive and are in the world, which is fascinating. Then somatics is a whole module on, whole pillar of 6 modules on somatics, somatic practices, somatic orientation, stabilization, like how to support people's nervous systems. Then what else? A whole pillar on human design and gene keys. So I'm going to teach professionals how to use that in their practices for themselves and their clients. Then all the integration. So, okay, so I've given you like 49,000 tools. How do you map all of this together to be an effective coach? And then the business of coaching. So how can you be a business professional with all of this? So marketing, niches, avatars, systems, structures, contracts, all of that kind of stuff. So over the course of 11 months, lots of, about 42 modules of training, which is all kind of pre-recorded training. And then 42 live Q&A, breakout rooms, coaching sessions, all of that kind of stuff. Where at the end of that, people can be certified as an Unveil, which is my company, an Unveil Master Coach, if they do some coaching hours, which will be observed and mentored. And there's all sorts of stuff in there where I'm essentially creating a system and a structure where really profoundly healing humans can be in the world. And I have some people doing the course who just want to do it for the curriculum only. They do not want to be coaches, but they want the education of being a healing human, just showing up in their world. So there's many tracks through, and I'm sure in your show notes, and we'll give people links to things so that they can hunt me down and find out what I'm doing, because I'm so unbelievably excited about it. I'm just like, it's the best thing that I've done in such a long time. And I can't wait to begin. And we begin on the 19th of September. And the group that I've got in there already are stellar humans. They're just really lovely, genuine people, and everything is trauma informed. So I am creating the safest space for people to be educated, because you know what adult education is like. You feel like you're going back to school and it's stressful. But it's also multimodal, multimedia. So we have a lot of neurodivergent people in the planet, and education doesn't cater for that. So we've got videos, audios, transcripts of everything, and all the homework, which is not complicated, but there is some kind of homework to check my teaching more than anything, can be submitted video, audio, written, don't really care, all multimedia. So
that is exciting.
I'm so excited. I can't wait to start. It's like, oh, can we just get on with it? Although no, not too quickly, because I do have 11 months of content to create. So like, I've got the first 3. I can get to Christmas. We've got till Christmas.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it starts September the 19th.
It does start September the 19th. We will probably be closing registration around the 9th, but because I've got all the portal filled and sort of stuff, if people want to trickle in after that, it will be possible this time. Yeah. And it's a founding member year. So it's the year where you'll get loads of access to me. But the whole goal of this is to replace myself. So people from these founding member cohorts will be, if they want to, be hand selected to work with me at Alethea, or to take over as faculty for the Unveil Academy, which is the name of the academy. So it's that kind of, I'm basically hot housing my own staff is what I'm doing. There's so many ulterior motives to doing this, but no, it said in a nice way. I'm hopefully, I've attracted a lot of people who are passionate about this, but really just need some extra education. And that's what this is. But there is absolutely opportunity to be mentored by me, work with me, and come with me as the whole world of Unveil expands.
No, it is really exciting. Well done, Victoria. I'm looking forward to hearing.
Yeah, it's it's an undertaking, and people think I'm crazy, but the feedback I've got so far for the just the portal area that I've created, that's really intentional. I think everything that I'm doing at this moment in time is intentional and deliberate. And the feedback that I'm getting from people is that it's being received in that way, which is just the best thing for me. I mean, anyone who's followed along in our interviews, Alex, will know that I've had a hell of a journey through all of this. And it feels like I'm kind of coming to, oh, that's what it was all about. That's what that hell of my life, the educational like ups and downs, has been about. And finally, it's coming out of me in a way that is of service to humanity. And I couldn't be happier.
That's amazing. I love that concept of intention. Something that came up for me last week was really just around the theme of how sacred life is, and that we should be thinking much more about our intention in, micro moments and little behaviors, as well as the big behaviors and the big decisions. What's the intention behind all of it? That was a really, I'm not suggesting that I do this well at the moment, but an intention of mine is to improve on this process and the concepts, because life is precious. And if we can bring intention to our day and our conversations and our interactions, that's a beautiful way to make the world a better place in its own right.
I wholeheartedly agree.
Amazing. Victoria, do share all of the links. As you say, we'll put that all into the show notes, so if people are interested to learn more about you, about the academy, about what you're doing, they'll be able to click on all of those different links. But as always, it is an absolute pleasure to connect. We'll have to make sure it's not almost 2 years until we do this again, though.
I know. And also we'll drop this here because like people can come over to my podcast, because I'm going to be interviewing you soon. We're going to get it in the diary, and we're going to have an Alex Manos interview. So the shoe can be on the other foot, or boot can be on the other foot, however we say it. And so that we can have a special interview where we get to dig into all of your stuff, which I can't wait for. So
yeah, that's going to be exciting. Victoria, thank you very much. And
thank you.
Speak soon.
Speak soon.